Welcome to Inside Out, the Emotional Awareness Podcast, a Mentalus Academy production. Let's learn more about ourselves, inside and out.
So, hi, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast today. Our podcast, of course, Inside Out. And we're really happy to have Erin Kern here today, who is going to introduce herself in a moment and tell us what subject she'd like to talk about today. I leave it to you, Erin.
Thanks very much, Daniela. So my name is Erin. I am a mom. I'm an engineer, and I work with a lot of people across diverse backgrounds. And a lot of my work hinges around enabling people to work together, bringing people from those diverse backgrounds together, often virtually, sometimes in person, and trying to ensure that everyone's voice is heard and that we also achieve our objectives as a team. And so when I was invited onto this amazing podcast, what sprang immediately to my mind were some of the challenges that I encounter in a work environment, trying to have different personalities come together and work fruitfully together. I don't know if you want me to continue right away. So the most challenging example that springs to my mind is sometimes we work with, I would say, high-powered executives who seem to have a very large ego, but also a very sensitive ego. And trying to manage that and have other voices heard at the same time, work with them, allow them to be productive, that's been a challenge to me. And it led me to really wonder, and this would be your expertise, but what is it that causes some people to have such a sensitive ego? And maybe they certainly come across as having a very inflated ego.
So, it sounds whenever you talk about these kinds of people, it's amazing to see that they are in positions of power and authority. Because, like you said, it's a dual thing. There could be a very fragile ego underneath that, but what's expressed to the world is this sort of I take up all the air in the room persona. So you're absolutely correct in saying it is difficult to deal with both aspects of that, just in general, in any setting. When there's a work setting on top of that, where there's a power dynamic, even more, right?
I would add the distinction here between you've mentioned both types, and I totally agree with that. The sensitive type and the ego inflated type, which might have similar, but I think it's different dynamics that plays around in here. I don't know what you think, Daniela, about that.
Erin, are you talking about those two characteristics in the same person, or are you talking about two different?
I would say frequently I would see them in different people. I have found that the more I get to know certain people, the more I feel that they're folded into the same person. And so what comes across perhaps in a meeting is just that very much taking up all the space, really difficult for other people's points of view to come across. The other people have to be, personally I am, but very determined to just still get their point across, that I understand that a lot of people don't have that type of confidence to persist in the face of such overpowering presentation. But then the more I've got to know some of these people, the more I realize I think underneath that there's a lot of uncertainty. It's not what first meets the eye at all in that person.
In a way, what I'm trying to say in those distinctions I've made, because when we see those uncertainty and comes with doubt, one of the ways to cope with the doubt is instead of letting it in and let's see, that takes a lot of courage and self-awareness to be able to say, oh yeah, I'm bothered here, I'm discomfort here. But when we don't have this capacity, most of the time we reject it in blocks. No, nothing passes, nothing goes out, nothing comes in. And in that sense, yeah, it gets to be very hard to work, adjust. That's the message with all those people.
Can you give a description of, there's just a generic description of what that kind of person would be like, which would be helpful? How would they show up in a meeting, for example?
In a meeting, they would frequently seek to take control of the dialogue. So speaking up first and frequently. And then if a point is raised, let's say there's a point on the agenda that we're going to discuss, this type of person might jump in very early and express a strong point of view. Or if someone else has spoken, they might go yes and really throw their weight behind that very strongly and very early on. And I know from experience after meetings that sometimes we'll hear from other people because, of course, I'm normally there in a facilitating role. So I myself might have a certain way of acting in a meeting if I wanted to have my voice heard and there was someone like this at the table. But as a facilitator, my goal is really to have other people's voices heard. And I have not figured out how to do that yet, especially in a graceful way. So there's other people who at the end of a meeting will let us know, I felt really differently about point A, but after expressed themselves so forcefully, I really didn't think I could speak up. And so that's the challenge that I'm really seeing. Like we have a pattern where these, and there's a few of them, so they're not unique, but where these people come in very forcefully and I think that they intimidate a lot of people because, as you mentioned, Daniela, they're often holding a high office at a given point in their careers. And then when they come in like that, it really shuts other people down.
So it sounds like the struggle is not so much that you have trouble necessarily expressing yourself, but it's that as your role as facilitator, it's how do you help make room for other people who might not be as much at ease to be able to express themselves and how to understand these types of personalities better. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely. Personally, I'm really curious as to what lead people to adopt such a forceful approach. And also, as someone who has definitely, if I'm just one-on-one with this type of person, I might push back and I might quickly realize that very, very sensitive to any pushback whatsoever. I'm very curious, is this is it nature versus nurture, or were they just born this way? Is this a coping mechanism that they've adapted? And then, yeah, I guess more tangibly in my day-to-day life, curiosity aside, how do I make a bit of space in a meeting for someone who is going to be much more tentative to share their point of view?
And you'll let me know, Nadine, if you agree with this or not. But some of these characteristics that you're describing actually hide something else. There's a reason why you're talking about these very strong personalities in the same breath that you're talking about these fragile egos. Because I think that's what often happens is that you asked before, why do they come in and just take over? What's going on there? Sometimes it's exactly that. If you come in forcefully, take over, and just take the floor, it really doesn't allow you to be challenged, which tells me that maybe that person feels very insecure about being challenged. So it's like strike first before anybody strikes out at you. And that's not uncommon in the business world to see those kind of characters ending up at the top of their company or fields because they're so forceful. So to the outside, it looks like confidence, but really it's the notes of fragility. To the second part of your question of how you deal with that, it is a tricky thing because you have to manage that ego that is fragile while at the same time allowing other people to have their say and working with the power dynamic that they actually do hold a position of authority and power. So that one's tricky. And maybe that's more of a question of how you structure the meeting and how you manage to, maybe they don't get to speak first. Maybe they get to speak last. Maybe there's a way to create a tradition, if you will, of this is how we hold our meetings. We start from the lowest person on the totem pole up or whatever, or manage it in such a way that they don't get to speak first. But I suspect that if people already know that about them, even if they get to speak first, they might not be willing to stick their necks out because they know that this very strong personality is going to come and railroad the whole thing. I don't know, Nadzin, what do you think?
I totally agree with you. Maybe about the structure, I haven't been in corporate world a lot, but I do think, as I've mentioned, those fragile personalities behind that doesn't allow any interaction because they feel threatened. And sometimes I don't know if somebody else starts or if their ego, which is sensitive, and we've just explained why, is managed in a different way. Sometimes it can be helpful. It can be helpful to protect them, even if protect maybe isn't the correct word, but to allow others to have space for themselves. So, because I think if you go against this ego power, this front they have is very strong and can be very destructive to others.
Often these types of people also, and I'm generalizing and it's not always the case, but often don't have a lot of self-awareness. So you're also dealing with somebody who doesn't very often sit back and take stock of themselves. So confronting them directly will lead them to really not recognize themselves, which is why it's so difficult to deal with them in this kind of setting.
And that is the threat to it.
Yeah, that definitely rings true, I think. That was something that I wondered about myself because some of their behavior from an objective perspective seems ridiculous, like really ridiculous. So to hear you say that they're not very strong on the self-reflective side of things, that makes sense to me. Is there a general, obviously each individual is unique, but is there a general thought on what causes this? What brings someone to be so strong, like just come across in such a controlling manner and yet really be very sensitive?
There's a couple of schools of thought and about how this type of, let's say, character might develop. One is if growing up, for example, someone has no boundaries and is treated like the king in their own family, then they're likely to grow up thinking, okay, I am the king. I am entitled to this. I am the golden child. And they carry that over into other parts of their lives, including their business life. Now, if you take that and you don't also cultivate empathy, now you have a real problem because now you have somebody who is essentially thinks that they're king of the world, but has no empathy for others and therefore doesn't really notice or care when they step over other people or speak louder than them or don't give them any space. So that's one. The other school of thought is that this comes from the opposite, the exact opposite of that. So someone who has been ignored or was not valued or who then feels like they really have to push their way in to be able to get the attention or accolades that they think they deserve. So they become extremely forceful in their way of being as well. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. Sometimes it can be a combination of both, or it could be that both lead to that, but in different ways. One is stems from insecurity, and the other one stems from not too much security. That's not what I mean, but rather too much expectation. So you start to believe your own hype, so to speak.
And what I could add to that is that in both of those cases, none of those characters has learned how to cope with what they're experiencing, how to cope with their environment, how to cope with themselves, how to cope with being told no. So it is a reactive form in either ways, in either school of thinking.
Yes, and neither can tolerate feeling like they're not enough. They have to believe that they're great. Otherwise, they fall apart.
Their self, or the idea of self they have. Yes.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. Yeah, it's definitely hard to manage people when you all meet as adults. And I think people, yeah, I'm just thinking we can't change people. They would need to want to change. We just need to learn to manage them. Would it be the same? So if we look at the flip side, because then so this has been a preoccupying theme for me recently, this type of very domineering personality. But another personality that really took me by surprise is those people who are very cautious, very quiet, very unwilling to speak up in a meeting. Just to return again to a business setting, because this is where the dynamics just seem fascinating and challenging. This was something particular. I think there can be regionalities to this. I learned that when I'm hosting a meeting with a bunch of people in the prairies, if I ask a question, I need to allow way more silence before someone might speak up. Whereas here in Quebec, people are talking all over each other. We're having a great conversation. And so at first I thought it was a regional thing, but then I realized that some people are just very, I don't know if it's insecure or they're just very cautious or they try to be very considerate of others, but you really have to pull their opinion out of them, which can be frustrating again when you're trying to get a group to engage and have a conversation. So does that stem, do you think, like in terms of schools of thought, do we have two different schools of thought on that as well as to what could lead people to that type of mechanism?
Part of it can be characterological. We talk about introversion and extroversion. So there's people have a tendency to either, or another way to look at it is internal processors versus external processors. So external processors will think aloud, literally, and internal processors will need the time to take the information, digest, and then come back with some sort of response. So in a meeting setting, it just makes them look like they don't know what to say or they're not saying anything, but chances are they might be processing internally. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, of course, is experience, like life experience. So if every time in your own sphere, every time you speak out, bad things happen, you're going to learn that speaking out is a bad idea and you're going to be extremely cautious about it. So it's a question of reinforcement versus not in your lifetime, how you develop that side of yourself. And then there's another aspect that you brought up, which is very important. Regionality, yes, but even more important, culturally. In some cultures, speaking out is seen as a very hostile and disrespectful thing to do, whereas in other cultures, saying nothing is seen like very disrespectful and hostile in many ways. So all those factors play in there. It's hard to figure out which one is prevalent in any meeting for any person, but I guess if you know the people a bit more, you might be able to say, okay, this is why this person behaves that way. And then layer on top of that actual real fears. I don't know, maybe one person's afraid that if they speak out and speak and say something that is not in line with the extrovert who takes up all the air in the room, that somehow they'll lose their job. So there's some real fears and background there that we may not know about.
And also uncertainty. You see, maybe that person that isn't saying anything reacts to not being certain and assertive about themselves in that particular way versus the other one that needs to take all the space to cover up uncertainty.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that by and large, most people probably find it easier to deal with quiet people. They're certainly a little easier to take sometimes. Although if you're trying to find out how they feel about something, it can be frustrating as well.
The quiet ones actually have a lot to say. If you can manage to get them to speak, you will see that they have very good ideas. They have very interesting things to add. They just don't feel that it's their place or they don't feel confident enough to do. So when you're managing a group, and again, it depends on what your role is in the group, right? You said facilitator, but depends in what capacity. If you're, let's say, an outside consultant, and these are all different managers or whatnot that you're dealing with who are at different levels in their organization, it's a little easier to do that and to manage it because you have no skin in the game. You're not involved. You're not part of the same company. At the same time, or differently, I should say, when you're coming in and you're part of the group, but your role is facilitator within the group, now that's tough because you're also navigating those same power dynamics for yourself.
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely true.
Hey everyone, we hope you are enjoying this podcast. Want to find out more about this topic and much more? Check out our courses at Mentalist Academy. Find out more at www.mentalistacademy.com. And now, back to our podcast.
In terms of what do you call those? Sort of team building exercises, workshops. Do you think that type of thing can be helpful for work colleagues?
I would say, in my experience, having worked on the corporate side and done quite a bit of that, it's helpful if everybody buys in, for one thing. If it doesn't just become a, oh no, we have to do another one of these again kind of thing. But if everybody's actually thinks that it's, and the only way people are going to buy in is if they think that it has some merit and somebody's championing it. So that's what it takes. It takes a champion. It takes somebody within the organization higher up to say, I'm doing this and here's why and here's what I think we need to work on. Then people will rally behind it. But if it's an initiative that's, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had some team building? Unfortunately, though, those don't work out as well. So it really depends on how it's framed, how it's brought to the table, who's bringing it to the table. That makes a
And
big.
who's participating as well? Because often those team buildings are for the staff, not for the high and managing. So if you're talking about those high characters that you're looking to help blend in with the group, so they exclude themselves from those activities.
Yeah, that's good.
If they are given, they have to be really focused on the whole aspect of communication and sharing space and how do we do that. And because often team building exercises can be very standardized, and you want to make sure that they're aligned with what you're trying to do.
I'm taking notes. Yeah, my job's interesting because the people with whom we work, the people who are on committees and on boards and stuff like that, they all come from different companies. This is something that they're doing generally on a volunteer basis, off the side of their desk, if you will. So I feel like it's part of what makes my job interesting, is to bring these people from such diverse places to a table together and try to achieve something. But of course, we feel we can achieve more if all voices are heard. Yeah, it's a challenge because we also don't generally, you're trying to lead from the back seat, right? I'm never a chairperson. I'm not a president. I'm there to facilitate and support. So, yeah, I'd feel that any insight that we can gain into people, because I feel personally, I'm a strong personality if I need to be, but I don't want to just bulldoze over people. And I also don't want to be unreasonably impatient towards people, either who are more sensitive and I want to hear what they think, or people who I want to support in their leadership role and they're not doing what I think they should be doing, for example, right? So, yeah, I feel that when there's people with very different personalities from us, especially for me, it seems to be more of a male thing. But this very strong sort of ego, that's hard for me to understand. And so I think any insight I can gain. Would you have advice for if you have offended somebody with that type of personality? So you're saying it's very hard for them to have that confrontation, if you will. So let's say that they perceive that has happened and they really withdraw. Do you have advice for how to re-engage with someone like that, where you really feel that now I won't say bridges are burned. I'm really wondering how to reapproach somebody who I think has been quite upset. And it's on a personal level, I would, you sort of know how to navigate that. But on a professional level, I'm really not sure how to approach it and how to take the first steps.
I think part of it is what you've already described, which is take an open communication approach, knowing that this bravado might very well hide a fragile ego, right? So it's actually not that different when you think about it when you're dealing with kids, or more specifically, even teenagers. Because teenagers go through a phase, most teenagers go through a phase like that, where they're very on the outside, like they've got this bravado, like, I don't care, whatever. But on the inside, they care very deeply, and they get very easily offended in a way. Everything kind of hurts because it's a period of their life where being accepted by their peers is so important, and all this other stuff. So it's like dealing with that, where you go in with a certain amount of empathy and understanding, but at the same time with some pretty firm boundaries. So let's say somebody did get offended, is to be able to say to them, look, clearly something I've said has upset you, and that was certainly not my intention. But going forward, I'd really like to know what's the best way for you to not feel like you were shut down, or whatever the person may have felt. And at the same time, give everybody an opportunity to give their opinion. Because then what you're doing is you're putting the power back in their hands, right? They're going to have to give you a modus operandi how to go forward with this, as opposed to either capitulating and saying, I'm sorry, I should never have said that. You're wonderful. I'm a terrible person. I'm exaggerating. Or on the other hand, is just to say, you're a horrible person. This is why this happened. And, it's going to happen again unless you shape up. Again, neither of those options work, but there's a way you can bridge that gap by saying, I understand that you would have felt upset. I certainly didn't mean it that way. So help me here. Going forward, how do we manage these types of situations? Nadzin, do you have something to add?
I would totally agree with that. I would highlight more the boundaries and how you've mentioned it. How would you do about that? If you suspect to have this kind of personality, I find sometimes setting those boundaries ahead can be really helpful to prevent those situations. So, for any case we get into a disagreement, what is the protocol and how do we go about it? I find that can be very helpful as well to preserve egos and to keep bridges open. So it is a professional way. Nobody gets involved emotionally in that because emotions can be a little bit tricky to get resolved, but it is setting boundaries and clear boundaries that are the same for.
I think you raise a good point, Nadzin, which is clearly, if you can set the ground rules to begin with to prevent this kind of thing, then that's great. Sometimes, though, we find ourselves in a situation where that ship has sailed, and now we have to kind of repair things. But knowing that those types of personalities exist, I think in any group dynamic, it's always good to have that in mind and already have those ground rules or boundaries, as Nedzin said, in place.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, unfortunately, often I feel I always try to take a lesson out of every unpleasant experience, and so that we can apply that lesson in the future. Sometimes it does feel as though one needs to go through a large number of experiences to get a good set of ground rules going. But yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, emphasizing communication, but I can imagine some boundaries that might help in that particular case as well.
Keep in mind that group dynamics are difficult because every group is different. So you could take, I don't know, let's say there's 8 of you in this group. You could take 6 of you, put you in another group with 2 completely different people, and the dynamics would change completely. The roles would change. And also, it's interesting, it's a bit of psychological theory, but I'll throw it in anyway. Group dynamics, often we end up replaying the same roles we've played in the rest of our lives, right? In our families of origin and whatnot. So if we were the youngest kid in our family who always got special treatment because we were the baby and everybody else was so much older than us, then we enter these dynamics with that same premise. We start to look for these older brother, sister type of figures, and whether they are or aren't, we turn them into that. We start to look at them that way. Similarly, if, let's say we had a very difficult relationship with our father because he was very authoritative, then we might see someone in the group who's authoritative as that father figure that we had difficulty with and immediately take a dislike to them. So to layer on top of everything, there's also the group dynamic, which we come in with our own baggage with. So it's complicated.
Yeah, that's a really interesting spin on things to consider, especially given that, yeah, there's yeah. Normally, I'm unfamiliar with my colleagues' personal histories, family histories, but certainly they come into our meetings used to being CEO or senior VP or whatever they are, and that could be a large part of our challenges, realistically.
Yeah, but even going further than that in their life, like what was it like for them growing up? Who were they in their family? Who place did
I
they occupy? Not something you can know in a work setting, but it's interesting to just add that layer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have a feeling some of our biggest issues run very deep. So yeah, that would be interesting to know.
And in that sense, if you do some group, like what you mentioned before, the team building thing, that could be a nice exercise to work with so they can see the roles they play in the family and how they present them at work and how can they work around them. That would be very interesting as
It's interesting, Aaron, you know this and you know this too, Nidzin. So I do workshops with horses as well. And it's always fascinating to me to see that, and the horses, for whatever reason, seem to bring this out in people even more. I guess because their reactions are quite natural to what's going on. So it never ceases to amaze me when I work with work groups, how that family dynamic comes out so quickly in that setting. Because people immediately take on whatever roles. Either the horse becomes the rejecting parent, for example, or the horse becomes the child that they have to take care of. And everybody just falls into that pattern. I can see who becomes the big sister, who becomes the dad, who becomes within the group. So you're right, Neds, and some of those team building exercises can bring that to the surface. But then you have to have the capacity to deal with it on the spot because sometimes some pretty strong emotions come out of those team building exercises.
yeah, and I would add in the setting of work, if you're talking about a child who had difficult parents or difficult authoritative images, having a boss, just the idea of having a boss can trigger that in them. So if I go back to what you're saying, Aaron, that some people don't talk in meetings, if they have a strong image or the strong figure in front of them, that will bring them direct to this dynamic they grew up in, and they will instinctively shut up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know that I'd be able to get my team together with horses, but that must be really interesting, Daniela, to see those.
It is. And I'm both done those and in my previous work on the corporate side, I've attended quite a few, not with horses, but just team building in general. And the common denominator between the ones that work and the ones that don't work is really what do you do with all that stuff that comes out and is exposed during those team building sessions? I've attended some where it was like, oh, okay, well, all this stuff has come out. Okay, nice to have met you all. Goodbye. That's not helpful. And I've attended others where they've really said, okay, we need to follow up on some of these things and we need to work on them. And again, the biggest common denominator is someone championing this because the ones that where someone is behind it saying, yes, we're committed to making this group more cohesive and we'll do what it takes. We'll commit to however many sessions we need to have. Those work. Those really work. People come out of there with a much better understanding of the dynamic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I asked the question because my group has been considering maybe that type of event. I haven't put much thought into it. So yeah, I'm sure it can be interesting.
Was there something else that we haven't touched on, you think? Or
Well, I'm just thinking through. I don't think so. I feel like we've covered it and had the chance to dive in. I think things will remain challenging, but it will obviously persist.
But yeah, maybe if you keep some of these notions in the back of your mind, even as you attend the meetings, it might help you look at things differently. You might be able to start to pick up on some of these. Oh, okay, that's interesting. I wonder what kind of dynamic could be behind that or what kind of background could have led to that. You're not going to get all the answers for sure because it's a work setting. It's not the same as a personal setting, but just maybe looking at things from a different lens sometimes could be helpful.
Absolutely. It also, through this conversation, I've been reminded that we also try to diversify the venue isn't the right word, but maybe speaking up in a meeting isn't your thing, but maybe commenting on a document is where you feel a lot more comfortable, or that type of thing. Certainly, when you talk about how much just the absence or presence of a couple of different personalities can change a dynamic, that I've learned to be very true. So little subcommittees sometimes can be helpful. Yeah, so I think I'll keep exploring that because, yeah, really, my job is interesting in that I'm really trying to help other people achieve things, which is nice and uniquely challenging. It's very much like parenting, where it would be much easier to do it yourself, but that's not the goal. Yeah, it's good. It's good to maintain a sense of humor, and it's good to maintain a perspective. There's a lot of things I've learned parenting that definitely helped me in my work life. But some things, fortunately, I haven't encountered this type of thing with my kids. I think you're right. The parallels to certain phases in teenagerhood, that's probably very accurate. So, yeah, I'll bear that in mind.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Erin, for taking part in this podcast and being able to be so open about things. I'm fairly sure you're not the only one who's having this issue, and I think a lot of people will probably be helped by listening to what you had to say. So thank you for being so open.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
See you next time. Find out more at www.mentalizeacademy.com